Welcome to The Explainer. You know, when you think about the European Union, it's easy to picture this one giant, unified thing. But what's really holding it all together is this fascinating push and pull, a system with these incredibly powerful, unbendable rules living right alongside some truly surprising exceptions. So let's piece this puzzle together.
And that gets to the real heart of the puzzle here. On one hand, you've got EU laws so strong they can slap a tech giant with a fine worth billions. But on the other hand, you find EU rules that are, well, more like friendly advice. So how can those two things even exist in the same system? Well, the answer is all about the two very different kinds of legal power baked right into EU law. Okay, so first things first, let's break down that fundamental difference. You really have to get the distinction between an EU law that you absolutely have to follow and one that's more of a guideline. It's basically the difference between a command and a suggestion.
Here's a pretty simple way to think about it. A binding act, things like regulations and directives, is like a speed limit. It's a clear, non-negotiable rule. It applies to everybody, and yeah, there are some serious consequences if you ignore it. A non-binding act, though, that's more like the scenic route your GPS suggests. It's good advice, it's probably a good idea, but you're not going to get a ticket for taking a different road.
And listen, this isn't just some abstract idea. It is written right into the EU's legal DNA. If you look at the official documents, they spell it out. Binding acts have real teeth. They're described as obligatory. But non-binding acts, like recommendations, are explicitly defined as having no binding force. Getting this one distinction is, well, it's pretty much everything.
So what happens when somebody breaks one of those big binding rules? Let's take a look at a really famous case that shows just how much power these laws have when they're put into action.
All right, so the European Commission, which is the EU's executive branch, went after Google. They accused Google of abusing its massive power in the search market. The specific charge? That Google was unfairly promoting its own shopping services over its rivals. Now, this is a direct violation of one of the most serious binding laws out there, competition law. This is not a friendly suggestion. Fair competition is a core, non-negotiable pillar of the whole single market. And this is exactly where that word binding becomes so important. Because these competition rules are mandatory, the European Commission isn't just sitting on the sidelines. It has the legal power and actually the duty to jump in, investigate, and enforce the rules. It basically acts as the market's official referee.
And the result? Well, after the investigation found that Google had, in fact, broken these binding rules, the consequence wasn't some slap on the wrist. It was a massive, multi-billion euro fine. That is what happens when a binding act is enforced. It has direct, and in this case, very, very expensive consequences.
Okay, so we've seen the raw power of a binding law. Now, let's zoom out a bit and look at the huge economic playground these laws are meant to protect, Europe's single market. And it all starts with its foundation, the customs union. The engine that makes this single market run is something called the Union Customs Code. This is the rulebook. And it basically says, hey, all 27 member states, for customs, you're all one big territory. That means no tariffs, no customs checks on goods moving between, say, Germany and Spain. It's an absolute game changer for business.
This legal text is the blueprint for that whole system. It creates one single, unified customs territory. So a truck driving from Lisbon to Berlin isn't really importing or exporting anything. The official term is intra-community trade, and the goal is to make it feel as simple as sending a package from California to New York.
Okay, but this is where things get really, really interesting. The whole system seems so straightforward. One big territory, one set of rules. But what on earth happens when a piece of an EU country is, for customs reasons, not actually in that territory? Which brings us to this fascinating little case study that feels more like a logic puzzle than a trade rule, the Canary Islands. It is the perfect example of how this seemingly rigid system has some really surprising built-in flexibility. So picture this. You're shipping a package from Barcelona to the Canary Islands. Now, both of those places are in Spain. Logically, that should just be a straightforward domestic shipment, right? Like sending something from Madrid to Seville. Let's just lay it all out. You've got a company on the island of Gran Canaria. Their supplier is on the mainland, in Barcelona. It's all happening within the borders of Spain. It should be simple. No customs, no extra paperwork, no fuss. But the reality is completely different. And here is the twist. That shipment is legally treated as an export. It needs customs forms, declarations, the whole shebang, just as if it were being sent to a country completely outside the European Union. How in the world is that possible?
Well, the answer is all about special arrangements made for unique situations. See, the Canary Islands, because of their history and geography, have their own special customs and tax system. And that system actually places them outside the main EU customs zone, even though they are politically part of Spain and the EU. It's a deliberate legal exception carved right out of that big overarching rule.
So, we've seen a massive, unbendable rule on one side and a really specific hyperlocal exception on the other. What does that actually tell us about how the European Union really works?
What all this shows is that the EU's real strength isn't just about making these huge, one-size-fits-all laws. It's about the very sophisticated and sometimes kind of surprising balance it strikes between those powerful rules and local flexibility. It really all comes down to this. On one side, you have these big, powerful rules, like the competition law in the Google case. They're there to make sure there's a level playing field for everyone. But on the other side, you have the flexibility for these specific local exceptions, like we saw with the Canary Islands, which accommodate unique needs without breaking the whole system. That's the core design of the EU, a structure built on both rigidity and agility.
And that leaves us with a much bigger question to chew on. This whole model, a system of huge, overarching principles combined with carefully tailored local exceptions, is this complex balancing act maybe the future of how diverse countries can work together on a global scale? It's a fascinating thought. Thanks for tuning in.